Welcome everyone to CGHE seminar number 206, and we're discussing the academic profession. Specifically, the topic is Whither the academic profession ? Does that whither have an H in it or not? Now, if it doesn't have an H, that might be one answer to the question, and if it does have an H, that's another. To pursue that discussion, we have Celia Whitchurch, William Locke, and Giulio Marini, who are coming off a major project for the Centre for Global Higher Education Research Program on the academic profession. And I think we're going to start with William, but before we hand over and before I introduce the speakers properly, can I take you through the webinar protocols? Remember that the webinar is being recorded and it ends up on YouTube within 48 hours and on our website, of course, and where you can see all of the past webinar recordings. The transcript of the chat function also goes up on our website. Now, during the webinar, please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or you've got to the point where you're asking your question in the Q&A. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but we advise you to turn it on when you're asking your question. It's more fun for everyone. We recommend you use speaker view in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking at any given time. Now, to frame a question, put it into the chat, write it out in the chat, and I'll select the Q&A on the basis of what's coming through in the chat. And generally speaking, if you come in early, you begin to formulate your question towards the end of the speaking presentations, around about halfway through the hour, or just after, you're likely to end up in the discussion, providing your question is focused on the topic of the webinar. If you come in late, no matter how brilliant your idea is, it may miss out just simply because we've got a full speaking list by that stage. And when you're invited to ask a question, you please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Now, it's a pleasure to introduce our speakers, and I'll start with Celia because she's the project lead, although she won't be speaking first. Celia is Associate Professor at UCL Institute of Education and the principal investigator on this project, which is called the Future Higher Education Workforce in Locally and Globally Engaged Higher Education Institutions. So there is a comparative dimension as well as a UK dimension to this work. William Locke, former Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education, has now gone to become Director of an arguably bigger and more important centre called the Centre for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Melbourne, where I did work at one stage in my career, in fact, two stages in my career earlier. And he's also joint editor of Policy Reviews in Higher Education, which he edits with Ellen Hazelcorn. Celia's interested in the academic profession, so is William. He also has an interest in governance and management and HE policy, and a history in policy making himself. Giulio Marini, a highly productive, I won't say emerging, I'll say emerged early mid-career researcher, now a lecturer in teaching at the Social Research Institute, associate researcher at the Quantitative Social Science, QSS SRI, and at the Centre for the Higher Education Studies chairs. So he's at UCL. He was formerly the postdoc attached to this research project, which is why he's here with us today. And he's got a wide range of interests in quantitative and qualitative research on higher education, and extensively published. Also associate editor of the European Journal of Higher Education. So Celia, of course, comes off a period having been editor of Higher Education Quarterly. So all three of our speakers are also editors of academic journals in the past or present. So great pleasure at this point to hand over to William Locke. We'll need to turn on William.
Beg your pardon. Yeah. Thanks, Simon, and to you and colleagues for inviting us to give this seminar on the CGHE Research Project on the Future Higher Education Workforce. Just going to share my screen. So hopefully everybody can see that.
Yes, we can see that.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Yeah, great.
All's well.
So today we're looking at how people are navigating their roles and careers in contemporary UK academia and how higher education institutions are responding. I'm going to start by outlining the research design of the study. Celia will then share some of our conceptual framing and emerging findings from the interviews conducted, and in particular the shifts in approaches to the professional formation of academics and how individuals are making their careers in the case study universities. Giulio will share some findings from the survey of the case study universities on the future intentions of those involved in academic work. Then I'll offer some thoughts on the context of these findings pre-COVID, which is when the research was undertaken, and then since the pandemic. I'll include some international comparisons and finish with some concluding remarks. So we'll be covering the micro, meso, and macro levels of analysis during this seminar. Let's see if I can advance the slide. There we go. So a bit about the research design. This is a longitudinal study which has involved 2 phases of interviews with the same academics in 8 case study universities, at least 2 years apart. The case study universities were selected to be as representative as possible of types of university, nations of the UK, regions of England, and disciplinary profiles as possible within 8 institutions. In the first phase, we interviewed 8 staff in each university, 6 academics and 2 senior managers. The academics included those at different levels of seniority, largely actually in the middle stages of their careers, but in different roles, teaching and research, teaching only, research only, and so on. And there was also a mix of some who included both, who had both academic and professional roles, and some who were what Celia has identified in previous studies as third space professionals. A good proportion of these had worked outside higher education at some point during their working lives. And this yielded well over 100 interview transcripts. And in between these 2 phases of interviews, there was a survey of academics at the same case study universities. Unfortunately, 3 of the 8 universities chose not to conduct the survey because they were undertaking similar kinds of surveys at the time, or there'd been a regime change since they agreed to participate in the study. Nevertheless, we collected 600 valid responses to analyze. And altogether, this is a rich evidence base for exploring how academics are making careers in contemporary UK universities. So over to Celia to share with you our conceptual framing and some of our findings.
Oh, thanks, William. Well, what I want to do is provide you with an overview of ways in which we frame the individual narratives. And this qualitative framing provides, if you like, the backstory to broad trends that are demonstrated by statistical data, such as that collected by HEIs and submitted by individual institutions, which is often neglected. So firstly, we identified an extension of what we found in the literatures, ideas of roles and careers as being either boundaried or boundaryless, whereby the individual either sticks strictly to institutional criteria and guidelines in planning their activities and careers, or rather seeks to build their reputation primarily through external activity and or by moving around between institutions. Sorry, I'm just trying to go to speaker view, but I'm still seeing William, but apologise if you can't see me. In practice, making an academic career is likely to be a dynamic process which arises from the interaction between the individual and their institution. That's been well documented. However, what we've done is look at Margaret Archer's theories, which describes this relationship as a morphogenetic relationship involving assuming roles and personifying them, and I'm quoting here, investing in them and executing them in a singular manner. And therefore, the individual's interpretation of a role or series of roles distinguishes them from other individuals with similar contracts. And this is what Archer calls unscripted performances. Excuse me. This process is facilitated by the diversification of the workforce, as William has mentioned, and the incorporation of, in particular, professional and practice disciplines. Examples from the study included people working in the health fields, humanitarian work, policing and probation. There was a huge variety. And this represents an expanding hinterland for individuals so that they can bring their own unique experience to bear on the performance of their role or roles. Similarly, with the expansion of activity associated with academic work, such as the student experience, community engagement, and obviously more recently, the online learning experience. We then went on to describe the relationship between individuals and institutions by developing the concept of career scripts that guide individual choice and decision-making. Institutional scripts are driven by, for example, promotion criteria, research output, and work allocation models, which are visible and quantifiable. By contrast, internal scripts are driven by, for example, personal strengths and interests, professional practice and work-life balance considerations, and are likely to be articulated via less visible, informal conversations and personal development plans, which may, of course, be confidential. What we picked up in the narratives was a creative tension between the two scripts, informing choices about individual people's activities and the way they went about making their careers. Next slide, please, William. Thanks. We then contextualized individual narratives within the conceptual framework of what we called formal and informal institutional economies. We used the term economy as a metaphorical frame referring to the production and exchange of academic and associated activity to which a value is ascribed by the individual. The formal economy we see as being driven by institutional career scripts, which represent objective markers of people's positionings, for instance, in relation to promotion criteria. The informal economy is represented by internal scripts through which individuals find ways of modulating the formal conditions they're working among, notwithstanding the fact that these may also be perceived as constraining and indeed restrictive and uncertain. But life goes on, and we were interested in finding out how people were working within these conditions. And what we identified was a shift in emphasis between the two scripts within the two types of economy. We found an evident willingness by individuals to articulate personal strengths, interests, professional and lifestyle considerations, not only to us as interviewers, but also to their line managers and to their institutions, together with the promotion of self-profiles and contributions via, for example, informal conversations with line managers and mentors, social media platforms, academic and professional networks. And this in turn has led to a collective shift towards a more fluid and open-ended approach to the professional formation of academic staff, accompanied by a willingness to push boundaries. This was indeed evident across different types of institution and discipline, which we found interesting. Next slide, please. Okay, so the final slide. I've attempted to summarize what we've termed this shift towards more open-ended approaches to professional formation of academic staff. And we can see that the expansion of disciplines has led to what we've called a disciplinary stretch, so as to incorporate extended academic activity and considerations arising from professional practice. Self-directed activity is likely to play to individual strengths and interests, supplementing activity directed towards institutional progression and promotion criteria. Priority may be given at certain times to internal scripts, which place emphasis on the informal as well as formal discourses that people are involved with. There was clearly a valuing of working conditions such as family-friendly policies, in addition to traditional academic freedoms and autonomy. We also identified a valuing of service contributions within local and global communities, as well as good citizenship within the institution. However, finally, it's very important to say that these elements of academic formation are not mutually exclusive. The emergent aspects we've identified don't, of course, preclude the more traditional ones, but they can be seen as a modulation of these aspects. So Giulio is now going to look at some of the findings of the survey in relation to factors predicting whether individuals may leave or stay in higher education. Thank you.
Well, thank you. For me, there is only one slide, and this is a survey mostly from post-92 staff working in post-92 institutions in any devolved nation in the UK. Basically, here we are trying to understand which is the profile of the person wishing to leave higher education. Okay, not changing university, just leaving higher education for doing a job in business, NGO, whatever. So the assumption here is that perhaps nowadays to work in higher education is not anymore that good. Now, as you can see, some variables don't have statistically significant p-value around here, but I can tell you in few words, which is the profile of this person who doesn't want to work anymore in higher education. Basically, people who didn't work in other educational level. So if you do have an experience of having worked in secondary education, for instance, you keep in higher education, because although higher education could be stressful, perhaps secondary education is even worse. If you do have a PhD, probably you want to keep to work in higher education. If you don't have that, probably you don't want even to start studying for that. And this is, quite important in post-92 universities where PhD used not to be essential as a requirement. Now it is becoming essential. People who are asked extra functions on top of the offer when they got the job, if they are asked to do more different things, they are more likely to say, no, I want to leave higher education. And also overtime. That's quite simple. They don't want to leave higher education if they are on an academic track. Academic track in the UK means that you do both teaching and research. Now, if you are teaching only or research only, probably you do also the other thing. If you are research only, probably you do some teaching and the other way around. But those tracks are different, and the academic one is the most prestigious and also the most secure. If people have a good relationship with deans, they don't want to leave. That's quite interesting, because here there is, the leadership dimension and the, social psychological one. So if you are not in a good relationship with the dean of the school, for instance, you are more likely to say, this place is not for me. People who are younger and also males complete the profile, and also studying. I mean, people who are studying usually getting a professional PhD, they don't want to leave. That's why, because they are studying, because they want to qualify, to progress, or to keep their job. So broadly speaking, in few words, that's the profile of the person who wants to leave higher education for a different sector, okay? Not just to change university. And that's quite interesting, because once upon a time, this was a good job, prestigious, secure, a good pension scheme, and so on and so forth. Nowadays, it is changing, and that's, it's not very dramatic, but not that beautiful as used to be, or as we believe used to be, which is sometimes tricky. So now I'll pass the word again to William, I guess.
Thanks, Giulio. So many of the trends identified by the UK study may have been accelerated and become more pronounced during the pandemic, while new trends appear to be emerging as well. This is being echoed around the world, and in particular in English-speaking countries with highly marketized higher education systems, such as North America, Australia, and New Zealand. But first, I want to take a look at some of the key trends that were already observable in such systems before COVID. First was the increase in the numbers and proportions of academics in roles that are variously described as teaching only or teaching specialist or teaching fellow or something similar to that. Although this increase was by less than the numbers of students had been increasing, and so staff-student ratios were already falling. And there was an increasing proportion of these teaching-only staff who were casual or sessional staff or even 0 hours contracts and so on. In Australian universities, for example, there are estimates that pre-COVID between 40% and 60% of undergraduate teaching was being delivered and student work marked by casual staff. Another trend was an increasing number of research-only staff, usually on fixed-term contracts, often tied to external research project funding, with no guarantee that their contracts would be renewed. The result of this was that academics were remaining early career for longer, especially in the humanities and social sciences, but actually across all disciplines. Because if they were lucky, they were moving from one postdoc position to another, one fixed-term contract to another, with the prospect of a permanent position never quite being realized, which in turn led to the definition of early career academic lengthening from, say, 5 years after the award of their doctorate to maybe even 10 years or even more. But even some academics who obtained a permanent job, who won external research funding as a principal investigator, who became independent researchers, even some of these seemed to stall in mid-career as opportunities dried up and it became harder to get published, or family and caring commitments just meant they couldn't keep up. One result of these trends is that the conventional gold standard of an academic career, the tenured or ongoing teaching and research role, had become the province of a minority of academics. And this shrinking core of rounded, tenured academics is a feature of all the major English-speaking higher education systems in the UK, in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And as the academic role became unbundled, disaggregated, and fractured, and as the demands on universities grew, the business of higher education became ever more complex and the stakes increased. Universities expanded their professional services staff to manage the now complex operations of teaching, research, and interacting with their external environment. So in all of these systems, professional staff outnumber academics, and many of them are increasingly involved in what would have previously been considered core academic work. So for example, research funding applications, impact statements, consultancy, big data, learning technologies, study support, widening access and outreach, and so on. And all of this was happening pre-COVID. As a result of a number of developments, but principally the financial shock of the pandemic, many higher education institutions appear to be changing their staffing profile again. In some cases, this may be merely reactive, unplanned, maybe accidental as a result of the need to rapidly reduce expenditure, the effect of voluntary redundancy schemes and so on. But in others, long-term strategic initiatives are being taken to deliberately restructure their staffing to mitigate risks and ensure future flexibility. And those who are dispensable, casual, sessional, fixed-term teachers are being dismissed or let go, collateral damage in the pandemic crisis. We know about the emergency shift to teaching online and the problems this has caused. We also know about the disruption to much of the research that was planned pre-COVID. But there were some silver linings to these clouds, such as home working and the flexibility this afforded many university staff, together with the sudden increased acceptability of online communications with other academics across the world. And this seminar series is one example of that. What we don't know is what the new normal will be in the new academic year, what the new blended learning and hybrid teaching will be in 2022 and beyond. There's also been a loss of fixed term and part-time researchers, as contracts are not renewed and tenured staff take up funding and opportunities that remain. Many universities have sought to reduce their professional support staff before making academics redundant. And while the research and analysis is yet to be completed, many of us will suspect that, or even observe that these developments are impacting women, ethnic minorities, and working class staff more than others. The upshot of all of these trends is increased workloads for all the remaining academic and professional staff, and especially for those responsible for teaching, supervising, and other student-facing activities, such that increasingly many on teaching and research contracts are in reality being forced to become, in effect, teaching only, or at least to adopt teaching intensive roles. So we have the loss of a significant proportion of academic and professional staff from higher education institutions, maybe for good, who knows? Some might return if things recover, others might not. In any case, one has to wonder how attractive a career in higher education is now, as Giulio was saying. And if we undertook the survey again now, whether more would be looking to move out, or depending on their current circumstances, attempting to get back in. If there were doubts before the pandemic about whether there is a single or singular academic career anymore, and what the prospects for the professional progress really are, there is likely to be a greater certainty now, at least until things settle down, if they ever do. So finally, to return to the developments that Celia was outlining, those who remain will definitely have to utilize the skills and strategies they have already developed in order to navigate their careers in the future. Celia spoke of the elements of the formal institutional economy, for example, contracts of employment, promotion and progression criteria, disciplinary and departmental affiliations, performance review and development processes, work allocation models, and so on. But faith in this formal institutional economy is likely to decline further unless it begins to recognize and incorporate some of these changes and reward those who have taken essential initiatives in the face of major disruption. In particular, this formal institutional economy needs to acknowledge innovative work, such as the development of online and hybrid forms of teaching and learning, increasing student access and engagement, the advancement of interdisciplinary education and research, and the transformation of curricula to address local, national, and global challenges. It needs to better reflect the lived reality of academic roles and working lives in the post-pandemic era. And maybe universities need to negotiate what could be a new psychological and social contract with their academic and professional staff, a new employment relationship that recognizes the full range of contributions that different staff make to the success of their institution. It doesn't establish unnecessary boundaries and create unhelpful distinctions between people, and that enables individuals to play to their strengths, to vary their priorities during their working lives, and opens up opportunities rather than closing down options. Thanks for listening, and we'd be very happy to take any questions for the time remaining.
Well, thank you, William, and thank you, Celia and Giulio. I mean, you've painted a very convincing picture, I think, of the trends that many of us can see. Although it varies a bit by country. You get, I mean, in the English-speaking countries that most of us know best, you see these trends playing out very clearly, whereas in, say, Japan, where the profession's more conservative and the university's a bit frozen, almost not moving in the same way, in the second tier institutions, the academic control of governance is still quite strong. For example, in many cases, in other cases, completely disappeared. So it varies a bit by country, and of course, Europe outside UK is also rather varied as well. But the question I want to ask before we start the full range of discussion, and Rosemary Dean will be our first one, is about stratification and how that plays out in relation to the picture you've created. What I'm thinking of is the fact that when you go to the top status institutions, the leading so-called world-class universities, you find that the role of the academic profession in governance as well as in academic matters is quite robust and traditional. That the managers are more, I suppose, and administrators are more on the back foot much of the time, and are less persuasive, less dominant. And those institutions are very much about attracting and holding the highest performing, highest status scientists and scholars. And to clip their wings too far would be, of course, to undermine the mission of those institutions. But also there's a almost traditional process of people making careers, of being developed and so on. And there's clearly in those cases a bit more money to play with as well, so that the precariat isn't quite as precariously placed. But this is, I suspect, quite a small proportion of the total. But what strikes you is that those institutions are running one now kind of academic culture, and a lot of others are being pushed into the one which you've described, and the more extreme versions of it, where the academic decisions are being made wholesale by professional staff about teaching and research matters and so on. So how do you read stratification in relation to the picture you've created? And I'm not sure who that question's for, probably for everyone.
Can I kick off?
Yeah.
I think you're right. There are differences, obviously, between different kinds of institutions, and the more research-intensive, larger, wealthier institutions. You're probably right. There has been a history of senior academics having more of an influence and a power within the university, but it's not true of all academics. And there is, in those kinds of institutions, there are also quite a lot of teaching-only staff who don't have that kind of influence, aren't necessarily members of the academic board. So even within those institutions, it's not equally distributed, that kind of influence and power. And I haven't done research into this, but working in a research-intensive university, or a couple, but particularly one during COVID, I think the move online and particularly remote working and making decisions by Zoom has actually strengthened the centre quite a bit in comparison with the rest of the academic community, which has become a little bit more compliant than it was before. Whether that'll be retained when we tend to get back more to face-to-face decision making, I don't know, but that's my impression at this point.
Perhaps I could jump in here just to say that it was quite striking, bottom up, looking at these interviews, that I looked quite carefully at people, particularly in Russell Group institutions, and it was striking that even those who seemed to be on a very clear track, and bear in mind that we were talking to people in what we call middle grades and mid-career. There was a sense of people developing or feeling that they had options. If things went wrong, that they were aware of trying to have other options, both within and outside their institutions. And I think there's no longer a sense that it's necessarily a job for life, however prestigious the institution and however strong your position at the moment is. I mean, if the research money dries up for whatever reason, or your particular discipline or particular specialty, particularly within the sciences, might suddenly, become no longer interesting or fundable or whatever. So, I found it very interesting that people were concerned to have different options.
If I can say a few things as well, thank you for the question. Coming from the continent myself, having done research about academic profession throughout Europe, this country, the UK, is really heterogeneous. So if you interview a person who is in his or her 40s in a post-92, and then you go in the same city or not so far away in a Russell Group university, it looks like you're talking to a different sort of worker. I mean, completely different. So, and also Simon, as you said, I mean, there's different metrics. Post-92 universities, they're driven by teaching-related drivers nowadays, very likely. And that's not the case that much in Russell Group universities. They don't have this problem. Well, the problem is to select students, not the number they might have, etc. And so that's a striking difference, and all the others apply as well. And also answering quickly to Rosemary, in the continent, in Europe, there's still more old-fashioned kind of academic profession. In the UK, there are academic professions, I would say, and not only the academic, non-academic and third space, but also within just the academic professions, there's very different kind of trajectories and experiences.
Well, let's bring in Rosemary directly into camera. Rosemary, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, so Rosemary Dean from Royal Holloway, UK. I'm interested in I'm not simply interested in the fact that there are differences between the UK system and also Australia, which you've talked quite a bit about, and other systems, but I'm also interested in how do institutions get past precarity? Because that's one of the major concerns. Now, there are lots of analysis of it, why it's there, who's affected by it, and so on. But the question is, how do you get out of that? And part of the reason precarity, well, the largest reasons precarity there are one, our system of research funding, where we release academics to go and work on research, not teaching. And also, if you have lots and lots of international students and suddenly they disappear, which is partly what's happened in COVID, but it's happened in the kind of last 20, 30 years for all sorts of other reasons as well, then you have an unpredictable recruitment level. So therefore you need people on temporary contracts. Now, one possibility would be that they go down the road of artificial intelligence, that they might even use robots for certain kinds of teaching, that they may come up with solutions that involve outside tech firms, because there's quite a lot of research looking at that as well. So that's the real question, I think. In a sense, you're identifying trends which are there at the moment, but I think there may be some other things underpinning that, which if the universities are going to get out of that precarity trap, and perhaps some of them don't want to because it suits them, because it allows them to kind of play their workforce in a way that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. But if they're going to get out of it, the question is, how are they going to do it?
Well, if I may then answer quickly, I would say that in the UK, the contract per se doesn't tell them much, because an institution may run some redundancies anytime, firing dozens and dozens of staff in a few months. So if you have a so-called open-ended permanent sort of contract, consider that the tenure, formally speaking, doesn't exist anymore for a long time, you're not really safe anyway. But of course, you need to deploy agency, whatever, in order to put yourself in a safer position, such as getting grants or many other things. So the difference here between the continents, say, is that the tenure really doesn't exist. I mean, and HR policies that are commanded by institutional strategy, they don't care about unions, they don't care about many things, they just use stuff as an economic factor. They try to minimize the cost. And it is pretty clear, if you are 50 plus, 60 plus, you may get an offer to enjoy a lump sum and you go home. It's pretty simple. So you're never safe.
Just to follow that up, and I agree, I think it's within the powers of universities themselves to improve the conditions of employment of what are currently termed casual staff. So it's about giving some kind of security. It's also about giving some kind of opportunity for staff development, professional development, whether it's in teaching or in research. So yeah, yes, I agree. It's probably not in the interests of institutions in very highly marketized and risky kind of environments. But if the funding were more constant, both in terms of research and student fees, then there wouldn't be the need for this kind of precarious labor. So it's a bit of institutional efforts and systems and governments providing a greater deal of consistency in funding.
We haven't been able to persuade government that stability of funding at a certain level is absolutely fundamental to all of this. You know, that a precarious academic profession is a less able and less productive and less pastoral, maybe, profession than a stable one would be. But it's clear that during the pandemic, you know, in the systems where the public good approach prevails, that they've had stability in the institutions and they've handled themselves on the whole pretty well. They haven't had to run at double speed to cope. They haven't had to false market to sustain their numbers, which unfortunately some systems have had to do, and so on. So, but the precariat, it seems to me, is the real question. And I'm not sure whether the position of the junior, the emerging academics, is being handled particularly well anywhere. I mean, it's always been a very hierarchical profession. The first years have always been very difficult everywhere. And I think there's something wrong with the way that works, even in the traditional systems, in the traditional stable academic environments, that we need to rethink. because it must be one of the factors that's making their profession unattractive to many really able people, on top of the instability and the lack of opportunities that we're discussing today. We've got a number of people now coming through. Can I ask you all to put forward your questions and statements now, because the call list will, I think, grow now at this point. But Hong Bui, I think, wanted to come in after Rosemary's comment. Hong, are you there, please?
Yes, hi, thank you very much for your research. And I've been conducting a research in Vietnam to investigate how university responds to the COVID. And I've seen an opposite trend with what Rosemary has mentioned, because actually COVID has been seen as an opportunity for higher education in Vietnam to transform itself. So I've spoken to high managers there, and they share that it is an opportunity for young academics to join the industry or higher education, because there's space for creativity and innovation in technology. So that is something that was very surprised to me to learn that, but it sounds positive in that sense. And I just responded to Rosemary. One of the possible reasons might be because students can't travel to the UK, US, or Australia, Europe. So that's why they stayed at home to study at home. And that the demand for higher education in the past 2 years has increased domestically, and that's why old people can't adapt to the new way of teaching, and that's why young people have a more opportunity to excel themselves. And the other thing is, I think in the case of Vietnam, because young people has been educated in Western higher education, what you call market, higher education. And then that is actually the opportunity for them to show what they can do, and they can transform higher education there, I believe. Thank you.
If I could just respond to that. I mean, I think some of the things, I mean, that's a very creative and positive trend. I like that. And there are some elements of that going on in the more marketized systems and in some of the research intensive universities. So I've noticed a real concern about the prospects for early career researchers or early career academics in their research particularly, and a need to, by the university, a sense of a need to support them and their careers and give and fund them and give them the particular benefits of travel to conferences and so on, which is just about still possible in Australia. Also, early retirement schemes that are particularly designed to free up places for, I guess it's mid-career academics coming through to replace the older, later career academics, and various other things. So there are elements of that more positive thinking. And also the third thing I was going to say was about how, as you say, how some of the younger generation of teachers are really getting to grips with online learning and more hybrid or dual mode forms of teaching students both in person and online at the same time. And they're understanding the platforms a lot better. And that's being recognized, I think, as well. And even some of the teachers or younger academics who have been relatively quiet, if you like, in the in-person environment have actually blossomed in the online environment. So, and that's all being recognized in many different ways. So it's not one way. There are some countervailing trends as well.
Yes, and I think this business about individuals being able to raise the profile of what they're doing, not simply with local managers and with peers, but with more senior managers. And I think, if institutions can meet people halfway, make more of an effort to really look at what's going on the ground, they'll find, ways of progressing within the resource envelope that they have. I mean, obviously more resources helps, but I think there's quite a lot can be done. There's a lot of innovative activity, both on the teaching side and in relation to the student experience generally, and into serving local communities, which we haven't talked much about. But that was very much on unprofessional communities, and a lot of people talked about that. Sorry, I'm losing my voice again.
Thank you, all three. Vincent Carpentier. Vincent, are you there, please?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for great presentation and findings. I guess you've probably have answered my questions, but it's about this idea of a new social contract that was on your last slide, which I found very interesting. And I was wondering what you think might be the drivers behind this social contract, whether it could come from institution, group of institution, policy, with the the idea you just mentioned that the retreat of upfront public funding is clearly one very big issue about how wealth is redistributed within universities. And I was wondering what would it be like a top down? Will institutions step up, or some institution will step up, or do we need like a kind of I don't know, Deering report or something like at policy levels? And the question to that is, what would be the catalyst of that change? Because this trend has been like going on for a while. Is COVID, a possibility to change this, or will there be another kind of catalyst to do this? Thank you.
Thanks, Vincent. It's very nice to see you again. I think probably it has to be a combination of university managements and trade unions developing that compact or social contract. I call it also a psychological contract, which is a term from human resources. Management literature as well. So it's that kind of, it's more than a legal contract. It's a contract of minds as well, as it were, minds coming together. There was elements of that at the beginning of COVID in Australia, where several 4 or 5 universities leadership negotiated with the unions and agreed changes to what are called the enterprise bargaining agreements. Each university has its own enterprise bargaining agreements. And some of those were along the lines that Universities of Australia were promoting, where security was provided to staff on the basis of reduction in slight reduction in salary or reduced leave or whatever it was. So that was the start, but it kind of got knocked out as more and more universities fell out with their unions over these enterprise bargaining agreements or lack of agreements. But I do think it has to be that kind of combination of the staff organising the unions and the senior leadership in universities in a policy and funding environment that's supportive, which it certainly is not the case in Australia.
Alex, I might move on to the call list if I can. I'm going to take 2 questions now because we're coming down to the last 10, 12 minutes. One from Hongwei Gu and the other from David Mills. So Hongwei, you're first.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is, with boundaries shifting in the academic profession, how is it meeting the expectations for relevance going forward into the future? Thank you.
And I think,
Hongwei, could you just explain what you mean by relevance?
Basically, what I mean by relevance is, how do you fit into this evolving business model that's now in society as a result of COVID, rather than just focusing on the academic-based part of the profession?
Well, as we say to our students, part of the process of answering lies in interpreting the question. So give it some thought while David Mills asks you what I think is probably the question of the day. David.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks. A really great presentation. Great to keep thinking about precarity. It's so important. I was always struck by the fact that historically, 1919, the Association of University Lecturers in the UK, it wasn't professors, it was only lecturers, was created. And that's the same year that Oxford first created the doctorate. Okay, the PhD, the modern DPhil as it's called here. So you get this timing of a growth in doctoral education at the same time as awareness of the precarity that creates for junior staff. And so I'm just wondering now, let's look to the present, to what extent is the way in which doctoral education has grown massively as a massive income stream for universities also contributing to this precaritization? Because of course, on the one hand, it's opening up higher education, it's giving everyone a chance through doctoral research, but then of course it's raising expectations around careers within the academy.
Well, if I may say a few things about that, thank you, David. It's a good point because it's very simple. It's a demand and supply. Now we have so many PhD holders that, okay, we can send them to post-92 universities, so to speak, but to some extent. And what about the others? So that's really, to some extent, engenders some precarity because you can afford it. The system can afford to treat the entrants that way. But my part of my own research is to understand how to help PhD holders to get a real job in the real world. I mean, meaning outside academia, because otherwise we don't exit this vicious cycle. So thank you for pointing this.
Just to follow up.
Yes, and to go back
Celia,
to
go ahead.
what I said before, particularly awareness of people, I would say, in their 30s about the possibility of moving outside higher education. And there's quite a lot of crossover, people feeling they could move, for instance, to policy environments. There were economists who felt that they would be able to move, for instance, to the National Health Service because they'd worked in health economics. I'm just trying to think of examples, but there was not only were the people who had gained synergy in their careers, if you like, by moving in and out of higher education. I think that is more common than is always given credit for. So, you know, I think this could not only will this be a result of the expansion of doctoral education, and in fact, you know, as you were saying, there are training programs now for doctoral students, helping them to think about wider careers. I'm trying to think of an answer to the question about expectation and boundaries, and this is I mean, I think the boundaries of higher education are more porous, and this is being recognised. Certainly the narratives demonstrated that. And to go back to Vincent's question, I mean, I know you're talking about the social contract between higher education governments and the people working in them, but you know, I think people are developing their own kind of contracts with themselves and the kind of careers that they might be able to develop. And as I say, gaining experience, gaining synergy, both within inside and outside higher education. And I think, you know, blurring of the boundaries of, I mean, higher education has always been porous, but I think there's more recognition of that now between people working, particularly working their way up so-called career ladders.
And just going back to
Yeah, William, you've got the
education.
last say, I think, on this important question, because then we'll go to a bracket of questions.
I think doctoral education is still basically training for the academic profession, even though there have been things bolted onto it in terms of skills development that might be kind of relevant to other knowledge industries or research in other kind of businesses. But it is still basically training people for an academic career, and you know, only a tiny proportion of doctoral students can go on and do that anymore. Probably even less now than before COVID. So I think we really need to look very carefully at doctoral education and what it's for, who it's for, and broaden it out rather than narrow it down any further.
Yeah, we clearly need a degree above the master's. The master's is like a first degree in many ways now. And often it's only a one-year degree in certain countries anyway. So even more so, it's like the fourth year of an undergraduate year, or the fifth year of an undergraduate education. So it takes you up to the old German masters, doesn't it? But, you know, clearly we need something more advanced, which is not necessarily heading towards research and scholarship. and teaching in universities. And we haven't invented that. No one has invented that degree that's an alternative to the doctorate successfully yet, apart from the, the tailored professional doctorates, which I've got I suppose a patchy history, and of course are very specific to particular disciplines. Now we've got of course, in the way of these webinars, the good questions are coming now in thick and fast. I'm going to ask 4 people to come in and then give you each one bite at the reply to all 4. So you'll need to take notes, keep an eye on what each person is saying, because they're all good questions. And Gwyneth and Taru, I haven't written to you in the chat, but please be ready. You'll be in this sequence. But first, Adam Matthews has a question.
Hi there. Thanks for the presentation. And I think you've kind of touched upon this a little bit already, but my question was around that hybridization between inside and outside of the university. But do you see academics maybe sort of unbundling from institutions and becoming more freelancers, where almost the Uber driver or the Airbnb owner putting their services onto platforms? Can you see a future for that, and how would that work?
Okay, that's an important question. Keep an eye on it. Now, and the next person is Suhali Jalil. Suhali. Hello, Suhali. We've spoken in the chat, so I think you're ready.
All right.
Hi, good.
It seems to me that thank you so much for the presentation. It's very insightful. Really appreciate the sharing of what's happening over there in the UK. It seems like precarity is the result of marketization of higher education to me. And being in Malaysia, one of the emerging hubs in higher education, would you think that the academics in Malaysia would face similar risk, or any country who are like Malaysia aspiring to be the next higher education provider? So how would this be better managed? Thank you.
Thanks, Suhali, and great to have you, given the time of day in Malaysia, great to have you in the webinar. Gwyneth Hughes, please.
I've actually got to rush in a minute, so I'll just be very quick, but I'm just wondering if we're all becoming nicer to each other with the COVID pandemic, a sort of informal academic citizenship. I've noticed lots of meetings, we start off by asking how everybody's coping with the pandemic, and I've also found a colleague who has hinted that she might have long COVID. So I'm sort of saying to her, I was going to ask her to do a review for my students, so I'm backing off because I realised that I'm being more sensitive, I suppose, to the needs of colleagues. And I just wondered if that is a continuing trend.
Might be an encouraging thought. The next and final of this bracket of 4 questions is Taru Sikanin. Hi, Taru. Good to have you involved.
Hi, thank you for the interesting seminar. I was wondering that what's the position of women in tenure track recruitments or in academic careers in general in UK at the moment, because we conducted a small survey in Finland, and we found out that many women find difficulties in proceeding tenure tracks in Finnish universities. And as the development has been really positive currently, but now it has been turned not to be so positive because these new career models have been implemented in Finnish universities. So I was wondering what the situation is in UK at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all 4 questioners. And colleagues, the 3 of you now have the final say, I think. We might take you in reverse order if we can, which would mean I think we start with Giulio and then go to Celia, and then we go to William at the end. Is that right? Yeah.
Thank you. Regarding gender tenure track, I would say it depends by also the family burden and the marital status. For instance, if you don't have children, sometimes it doesn't make any difference if you are male or female. If you do have children, you're separated, divorced, etc., that's a completely different story. So that's a factor for your own successful career, whatever you may colleague. I mean, of course, there's no tenure track because there's no tenure, but there is similar kind of trajectory. I can tell something about self-employed people or going back to the real world, etc. It may happen. Sometimes people are self-employed and they are poached by post-attitude universities because they're really strong in something specific and they really can inform students about the very profession. I can't say to what extent the other way around may happen if they are fed up with working with higher education. May happen, but you know, it is true that people want to leave higher education, but it is also running income, and the self-employed situation is not. So, you know, people want to leave, but you think twice before leaving, especially today under COVID-19. They're not sure you can have a business.
Celia.
Yeah, taking questions in order. There was significant evidence of people, if not formally working part-time, and some indeed were, undertaking community work, artistic endeavours, media work. Somebody called it sort of patchwork lifestyle. And I think, yeah, I think that is a trend that people may choose as well as be obliged to go in that direction. The question about precarity and how to manage it better in future. Again, I would say to institutions, listen to your staff. And in fact, there were narratives from at least a couple of very enlightened HR directors, and I don't usually regard them as enlightened, who at least were saying to the interviewer, we must listen to our staff more. And that plays into what I was talking about earlier, the innovation that is going on ground level that I think institutions don't always realise. So I think that relationship needs reinforcing it in a less hierarchical way. Are we all being nicer to each other? Well, obviously our work took place before the lockdown, but I think that is a valid point and long may it continue. Women in tenure track recruitment, yes. Well, 65% of our interviewees were women, actually. But as Giulio has rightly made the point, it's really family responsibilities and children that's kind of make the difference. But certainly when one looked at it, male partners were equally keen to have a work-life balance as women, although we were interviewed more women as it happened. So I think this dual career couple contract is you know, something that, again, institutions need to be aware of. Elder care as well, I might add. A number of people talked about elder care. I think that's covered them all.
Sorry, I disconnected at the end of Giulio and the beginning of Celia, so I've missed some of what you said. But
well done, Celia. You did cover everything. Go, William. You got the last word.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So because I disconnected the end of Giulio and the beginning of Celia, so I wasn't quite sure what you said. But anyway, I'll soldier on. In terms of unbundling academics from universities, I did actually put this in a provocative paper a while ago, that the idea being that some sort of high profile academics in terms of teaching could sell their services to a number of different universities throughout the world because of online education. And it was a bit of a throwaway comment, but of course it got picked up by the journalists. I don't think it's necessarily likely to happen, but it's possible that a few people could become that sort of star teacher as well as you have star researchers. In terms of precarity and marketization, I think it's not so much, I mean, marketization plays a big role in this, obviously, in terms of universities wanting to be more flexible. But I think it's more about reputation and research, actually, than marketization. So any system that is driven by research reputation rankings is probably affected by this as much as marketization. Though the two often go together in tandem. Are we being nice? I'm going to finish on this one, if I may, because it's a nice positive end. I've noticed that, yes, in terms of people's research careers, we are making, we're taking account of what's happened and the kinds of effects that they've had on people's research careers. I do notice people, as we are actually getting back to face-to-face contact in Australian universities now, I do notice people are asking more about each other. I'm not sure how long it'll last, but we'll see. Let's hope it does last.
Look, thank you all. I think that, you know, the fact that you had such a large participant audience today for what is essentially largely a UK, you know, project, and that there's a lot of interest around the world. People were tuning in who don't usually tune in to our webinars, and the questions reflected that. You know, your work's really important. I mean, I think that there'll be interest in it as it's published more. And if you want to come back and present again with a further development of your findings, perhaps a final one, that would be very welcome too. I mean, you're discovering all kinds of things. Enlightened HR directors and other great discoveries are going on here. Yeah, warm thanks and congratulations for what's an important, you know, body of work. Colleagues, our next webinar is on Thursday this week, and it takes us to some very interesting questions about transnational education and how it intersects with urbanisation and city spaces. And Jana Klibet, who's an economic geographer with a focus on globalisation, is going to take us through that conjunction of place and mobility, which we often talk about in these webinars. But thank you again to Celia, William and Giulio, and thank you all for participating, and bye for now. See you on Thursday.